All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's biology review class. Now, today we started a new section. We started section 4.1, and we're going to talk about ATP and chemical energy. So, ATP is pretty much, if you want to talk about it in layman's terms, is basically the chemical energy that the cell uses to undergo a bunch of different processes. Um, and what we're going to do is we're going to define the definition. Now, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Okay, so that's pretty much the energy source that the cell uses in order to provide chemical energy. Now, the formal definition of ATP is that ATP is a molecule that transfers energy is a molecule that transfers energy from the breakdown of food molecules breakdown of food molecules to cell processes. Okay, so another important characteristic of of ATP or adenosine triphosphate is that cells use ATP for functions such as building molecules, cells use ATP for functions such as building molecules and moving materials by active transport. Moving materials by active transport. And we know that active transport requires energy to move materials from one area of the cell to another. So, real quick, and let's see if there's anything else worth mentioning of ATP. And of course, it's worth mentioning that that the energy carried by ATP by ATP is released when a phosphate group the energy carried by ATP is released when a phosphate group is removed from the molecule. Is removed from the molecule. Now, let me try to illustrate that. So basically, ATP is we'll draw it out like this so you guys have an idea. Obviously, this is not necessarily the structure of the ATP molecule, but just imagine a chain of molecules, if you will. And again, this is not necessarily the structure of the ATP, and this is just an illustrative example. Later on in another video, we'll talk more in detail about the molecular structure of the adenosine triphosphate molecule. So basically, the three phosphate groups are linked together and through chemical bonding, of course. And if I need energy from an ATP molecule, pretty much what happens is that energy is applied and it causes these chains to break, and as they do, energy is released. So that's what that last sentence is saying. It's basically saying that the energy inside of an ATP molecule is released when it's broken down. So basically, if this is ATP, then that would be ADP, which would be two phosphate molecules. And then that would be, if I broke this, that would then turn into AMP, meaning one phosphate molecule. But that's a little bit further down the line, just so you guys have an idea. So once again, the ATP is adenosine triphosphate, is a molecule that transfers energy from the breakdown of food molecules to cell processes. It says cells use ATP for functions such as building molecules, moving materials by active transport, and the energy carried by ATP is released when phosphate groups is removed from one molecule. Right now, eh, one second, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. Another important thing regarding ATP that is good to have or to understand is the following. It says when phosphates remove, energy is released and ATP becomes ADP. ADP is a lower energy molecule that can be broken down into ATP by adding a phosphate group. Okay. So let's just write. So when this breaks down, we have the forming of ADP. So ADP is basically is a lower energy molecule energy molecule I'm sorry guys, it's a lower energy molecule that results from the breaking from the loss of a phosphate group in ATP. So basically, when this breaks down and energy is released, and let's see if I can illustrate. So basically, let me see if I can erase this line right here. Okay, so let's say we have our ATP. Energy is released, so that means that this no longer exists right here. Neither does this. And that leaves me with ADP, which is basically two molecules of phosphate, right? So let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and clear the board. And we'll move on to more important characteristics of ATP. And it says um, something worth mentioning is that the foods that we eat do not contain ATP. It does not contain ATP. Um, the food must be digested. Okay, so the foods that we eat don't contain ATP per se, but the food, in order for us to obtain ATP, in order for ourselves to have or to obtain, I'm sorry, ATP, they must be digested. Okay, they must be digested. And one of the functions of digestion is to break down foods into smaller molecules that can be used to make ATP. Okay, so one of the functions of digestion is to break down food into smaller molecules that can be used to make ATP. Okay. So that's another thing worth mentioning about chemical energy and ATP, and also is that ATP molecules that are made from the breakdown of food. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. The number of ATP molecules, that's the number of ATP molecules that are made from the breakdown of foods that are made from the breakdown of foods is related to the number of calories in food. Is related to the number of calories of food, but not directly. Now, this is something I want to mention. So, basically, what calories are a measurement of energy of the foods that we eat. And we consume, or the amount of calories that we consume is basically related to the amount of energy that we expend. So, like if you were exercising a lot and your metabolism accelerates and you get hungry, so you have to eat a certain amount of calories. Or if you work in a job, or someone works in a job that requires a lot of physical strain, well, they eat a lot of calories. So that's why it's the amount of ATP molecules is related, excuse me, to the amount of foods that we eat, but not necessarily directly related, because um if we eat more calories than we use, our body begins to store them, right? And that's how in some cases it can result in weight gain, or other things. So let's move on then to the next page. And another important thing, or speaking of molecules or food molecules that make ATP, let's talk about a few. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to mention is that lipids store the most amount of energy. Okay, so contrary, it's not carbs, but it's actually lipids store the most amount of energy. Lipids store the most amount of energy. Um, and basically, a typical triglyceride can be broken down. A typical triglyceride molecule, which is a type of lipid, triglyceride molecule, a typical tri excuse me for a second, glyceride can be broken down to produce about 146 ATP molecule. Now, of course, its body chemistry is much more complicated than this. This is just a general overview of what it is, but basically, lipids are very important as energies, or in the production of ATP. But the problem with our bodies is that if we consume more lipids than than we need, the body's going to store them. Um, okay, so proteins don't necessarily have, let me write that down. Proteins don't necessarily produce energy, but I want to write it the way it's in your textbook, so that way, um, or proteins store the same amount of energy as carbs. Um, and one thing is that the amino acids that cells can break down to make ATP are needed to build new proteins. Great. Vamos a seguir por ahí. Let's continue here then, guys. It says plant cells also need ATP, so it's not just animal cells. ATP, but plants make their own. And plants produce their own ATP via photosynthesis. We're going to discuss photosynthesis in the next two sections, but basically, photosynthesis is the process in which plants convert light energy into chemical energy. Okay. Now, speaking of photosynthesis, not all organisms that are autotrophs or that can make their own energy are necessarily photosynthetic organisms. We also have organisms that can use chemical to produce their own energy source, which is what we're going to talk about now, which is called chemosynthesis. Certain algae use sulfides and other chemicals to produce their own energy, but basically, what chemosynthesis is the process by which some organisms by which some organisms use chemical energy to, or instead of light energy, I'm sorry, instead of light energy to make storing carbon based molecules. To make energy storing carbon based molecules. It says chemosynthetic organisms make their own food. So it's like photosynthetic organisms, chemosynthetic organisms make their own food. So to sum up, basically ATP is the chemical energy that both animal cells and plant cells need, and there are different ways of making them. In the case of us, we need to eat foods that can help our bodies produce ATP. In the case of photosynthetic organisms like plants and even some bacteria, they use light energy to make their own foods, hence eventually generate their ATP. And we have organisms that are chemosynthetic organisms, which use chemicals to make their carbon based storing, or they're energy storing carbon-based molecules like certain algae. So guys, hopefully this video will help you review and understand that section a little better, and we'll see each other in our next class. So stay safe. Bye.